The humidity hung over the southern coastline like a wet wool blanket, thick enough to muffle the sound of the cicadas grinding in the oak trees. I stood on the lower deck of the estate, the collar of my dark navy polo sticking to the back of my neck. The evening light was fading into a bruised purple, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. Everything about this property felt heavy with a century of old money and unspoken debts, but the only thing I could focus on was the profound, sudden silence settling between us. It was the kind of silence that finalized things, the kind that meant there was no going back to pretending. Madeline leaned forward over the dark wrought iron railing of the upper porch. She wore a light peach, form-fitting sleeveless top and a crisp white linen skirt, the fabric catching the faint, sluggish breeze coming off the marsh. Her blonde hair fell in soft, unstructured waves around her face, framing eyes that looked far too exhausted for a Tuesday evening. I kept my back partially turned to the driveway, my posture rigid, my hands shoved deep into my pockets because the alternative was reaching out to steady her. Bella, her daughter, and my ex as of 3 weeks ago, had just driven off in a cloud of gravel and dramatic accusations. The taillights were gone, leaving behind a mess of unpaid credit lines and a hollowed-out trust fund that had finally caught up to the family name. Madeline didn't look at the empty driveway, she looked down at me. The tension in her shoulders slowly dropped as the property grew quiet. She held my gaze, the air growing dense, heavy with the weight of the last 6 months of polite nods and careful boundaries. She didn't blink. She just let out a shaky exhale, the sound barely audible over the wind in the leaves, and whispered, "You know this was never just friendly." The words didn't shock me. They just named the quiet gravity that had been pulling at the floorboards beneath us. I didn't step closer. I didn't offer a charming, easy smile. I just nodded, the weight of her admission acting as a tether, grounding the chaotic noise of the last hour. "I know," I said, my voice low, measuring the exact distance between the bottom step and the railing. "But right now, you have a notice of default sitting on your dining room table, Madeline. We need to look at the ledgers before the county clerk opens tomorrow." I didn't wait for her to process the shift in my tone. The threat was real, and the time for assessing our personal collateral would have to wait. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary I had just drawn. The sanctuary I offered wasn't empty words, it was a tactical plan. She turned, her hand trailing along the iron railing, and walked toward the heavy oak front door. I pulled my hands from my pockets and followed her inside, leaving the oppressive heat of the porch behind. The interior of the Gardner estate was usually immaculate, a testament to Madeline's relentless dedication to preserving her family's history. Tonight, the dining room looked like a war zone. The long mahogany table was buried under a snowdrift of legal correspondence. Bank letterheads, foreclosure threats, and threatening missives from a holding company called Apex Capital. Bella's father had used the family estate as collateral for a series of highly leveraged commercial loans before he vanished, and Apex was moving to liquidate. Madeline had called me 2 hours ago, seeking a temporary workaround just to keep the lights on for another month. But temporary wasn't my profession. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair, the legs scraping against the antique rug, and sat down. I pulled the primary stack of bank statements toward me. "They're claiming a default on a balloon payment," I said, pulling the cap off my fountain pen. I didn't look up at her. I focused entirely on the data, letting the numbers organize the chaos in my head. "But the amortization schedule they attached to the notice is flawed. Look at the interest capitalization rate here." I tapped a specific cell on the printed spreadsheet. They used a compound schedule that violates the original covenant filed in the county records. It artificially inflates the principal to trigger the default clause early. Madeline walked around the table and leaned over my shoulder to look at the paper. She was close enough that I could smell the faint trace of vanilla and rain on her skin. I immediately tightened my grip on the pen, forcing my focus into the blue ink on the page. My jaw clenched instinctively. I kept my breathing steady. "Are you saying the notice is invalid?" she asked, her voice steadying, the panic from earlier beginning to recede. "I'm saying it's a trap," I replied, my tone clinical. I flipped to the 3rd page, running my pen down the signature line. "If you sign the forbearance agreement they sent yesterday, you waive your right to contest the original loan structure. It's a standard predatory squeeze." I set the pen down, capping it with a sharp click, and finally looked up at her. You don't sign anything. You let me pull the nested LLC filings for Apex tomorrow morning. I will map the shell structure and file a list pendants to freeze the asset. Her shoulders dropped, a microscopic release of tension that I felt more than I saw. Bella said you were just a human calculator, she murmured, pulling a stray piece of paper out of the stack to tidy the pile. Bella didn't like it when the math didn't agree with her spending habits, I stated plainly. I didn't take the bait to insult her daughter. It was inefficient and unnecessary. I reached for the next stack of files. I need your authorization to act as your representative with the county clerk. We establish a timeline and we don't deviate. I didn't ask her how she felt about it. I handed her a blank authorization form from my briefcase and pointed to the bottom line. She took the pen from my hand, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. I didn't pull away, but I didn't linger. She signed her name with sharp, precise strokes. The first concrete step was locked in. The next morning, the reality of the threat materialized. At 9 a.m., a courier arrived at the estate with a certified letter. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a mug of black coffee, while Madeline was on the phone with the estate's groundskeeper. She signed for the envelope, her face paling as she read the return address. She walked back into the kitchen and set it on the granite counter in front of me. "It's from the county," she said, her voice tight. A notice of expedited hearing. Apex filed a motion to bypass the standard 90-day review period. I picked up the letter. The paper was heavy, official. I scanned the text, my eyes locking onto the filing date. "They claim they have a quitclaim deed," I said, reading the second paragraph out loud. "Allegedly signed by you 5 years ago, surrendering your majority stake in the property in exchange for debt forgiveness." Madeline grabbed the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "I never signed a quitclaim. Never. This house has been in my family for 4 generations. I would burn it down before I signed it over to that firm." "I know," I said. I stood up, taking my coffee mug to the sink and setting it down. If they filed a fraudulent deed, they left a digital fingerprint. Nobody fakes a county-stamped document without creating a discrepancy in the metadata. I pulled out my phone and dialed my law partner, Thomas. "Vaughn, I need the 2018 through 2020 notary commission logs for the 3rd District. Apex Capital just played a forged hand, pulled the structural data on their parent company." I hung up and looked at Madeline. She was staring at the letter, her breathing shallow. The sheer weight of the bureaucracy was threatening to crush her. "Look at me," I said, my voice dropping into the quiet, authoritative register I used during corporate audits. She lifted her eyes. They were wide, tracing the lines of my face for any sign of doubt. "We deal in facts, Madeline. A piece of paper with a fake signature is just a piece of paper. It is not a wrecking ball." I stepped closer, stopping exactly 2 feet away. "I am going to build a timeline that proves you were nowhere near a notary on the date they claim. You are going to pull every calendar, every receipt, and every email you have from March of 2019. We build the wall today." She nodded, the panic in her chest subsiding as she received a direct, actionable task. "I have the old planners in the library," she said, pushing away from the counter. "Good, start there." I watched her walk out of the kitchen, her spine straightening with renewed purpose. I stayed where I was, pulling out my laptop and opening the encrypted terminal to access the state property records. The external pressure was escalating, but panic was a useless metric. Over the next 4 days, the library became our command center. The large oak desk was covered in highlighters, sticky notes, and printed emails. The air conditioner hummed a steady, monotonous drone against the oppressive southern heat outside. We fell into a rhythm. She would find a receipt or a calendar entry. I would cross-reference it against the timestamps of the alleged Apex filings. It was a Tuesday night, just past 11 p.m. The house was dead quiet. The only light in the room came from the brass banker's lamp on the desk and the glow of my laptop screen. I was tracing a series of wire transfers through a nested LLC out of Delaware. The numbers were blurring slightly. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling the tension coiled in my muscles. Madeline was sitting on the leather sofa across the room, a box of old tax returns resting on her lap. She had kicked off her shoes hours ago, her feet tucked under her. She looked up, catching me rubbing my neck. You've been staring at that screen for 6 hours, Luca, she said softly. The capital flow doesn't match the depreciation schedule they filed, I replied, not looking away from the monitor. If I can prove they over-leveraged the secondary asset before the date on the quitclaim, the entire foundation of their lien collapses. I heard the soft rustle of paper as she set the box down. Footsteps approached the desk. A glass of ice water appeared next to my keyboard. The condensation was running down the sides, pooling on the leather coaster she had placed beneath it. Drink, she commanded gently. I stopped typing. I looked at the glass, then up at her. She was standing right beside my chair. The proximity was a sudden, sharp spike in the quiet room. I could see the fatigue lines around her eyes, the smudge of ink on her left index finger. I didn't reach for the glass immediately. I kept my hands flat on the desk. "Thank you," I said quietly. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know how much time this is taking from your firm." "My firm is fine," I stated, my tone firm. "I don't leave tasks unfinished, Madeline. Especially not when the opponent is relying on intimidation instead of evidence." I finally reached for the glass, taking a long drink of the cold water. It grounded me, pulling me back from the edge of exhaustion. She didn't move away. She reached out and adjusted the brass lampshade, tilting it so the glare didn't hit my screen directly. It was a tiny, functional movement, but in the silence of the library, it felt incredibly loud. The way she anticipated the discomfort of the light. The way she managed the environment around me while I fought the numbers. I almost reached up to touch her wrist as she pulled her hand back. The impulse was there, sharp and heavy in my chest. Instead, I tightened my grip on the glass, the ice clinking loudly against the sides. I set it down. "I found the discrepancy," I said, shifting my chair slightly to face the screen again, re-establishing the perimeter. "The notary stamp on their deed has a commission number that wasn't issued by the state until 14 months after the date of the signature." Madeline inhaled sharply. "Are you sure?" "I don't guess," I said, hitting the print command on the keyboard. The laser printer in the corner whirred to life. "It's a digital composite. They lifted your signature from an old filing and stamped it with a post-dated notary seal. It's felony fraud." The printer spat out the pages. I stood up, retrieved them, and handed them to her. She looked down at the proof, the undeniable reality that the nightmare was based on a lie. Her hands were shaking slightly. "We have them," I said, my voice steady, offering no false hope, only factual certainty. 2 days later, the midpoint twist arrived, wrapped in a legal envelope. It was raining, a torrential downpour that turned the sky the color of bruised iron. The power had flickered and died an hour ago, leaving the estate reliant on the gray light filtering through the tall windows. We were in the living room. I was packing up my briefcase, having just finalized the subpoena request for the notary's original logbook. There was a heavy knock on the front door. I held up a hand, silently telling Madeline to stay put, and walked to the foyer. It was a process server, dripping wet. He handed me a manila envelope and walked back to his idling car without a word. I closed the door, locked it, and walked back into the living room. Madeline was standing by the fireplace, her arms crossed tight against her chest. I opened the envelope, pulling out the single sheet of paper. "It's a notice of immediate occupation," I said, my voice flat, scanning the legal jargon. Apex petitioned the court to install a receiver on the property, citing an emergency risk of asset degradation. The judge signed it. They have the right to change the locks in 48 hours pending the final hearing. The color completely drained from Madeline's face. She didn't scream or cry, she just stopped moving. The absolute stillness of a woman who had just been told she was losing her history. 48 hours. She repeated, her voice hollow. They bypassed the fraud claim entirely. They just want physical control of the house. "They're panicking," I said immediately. "They know I pulled the notary logs. This is a Hail Mary to force you into a settlement before we get in front of a judge." "Luca, if they change the locks, I can't protect the archives. The original architectural plans, my grandfather's ledgers, they'll destroy them." She looked at me, the armor finally cracking. "I can't lose this place. It's the only thing I have left that's real." The rain hammered against the glass. The room was growing darker by the minute. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell her it was going to be okay. I dropped the notice onto the coffee table and walked over to her. "You aren't losing the house," I said. "How can you know that?" she asked, a sliver of desperation bleeding into her voice. "They have a judge's signature." "Because a judge's signature based on a fraudulent premise can be stayed with an emergency ex parte motion." I stopped directly in front of her. "I am going to the courthouse at 7 a.m. tomorrow. I am going to file a writ of mandamus, compelling the clerk to freeze all access to the property until the notary fraud is addressed." She closed her eyes, her breathing ragged. The fear was a physical presence in the room. I kept my hands at my sides for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I reached out and took her hands in mine. Her fingers were ice cold. I didn't rub them, I didn't stroke her skin. I just held them with a firm, absolute grip. The transfer of stability. "Listen to me," I commanded softly. The noise of the rain seemed to fade into the background. "The chaos is outside. In here, we deal with the next step. You pack the vital records into waterproof bins tonight. I will stop the receiver tomorrow. That is the plan." She opened her eyes, looking down at our joined hands, then up at my face. The tremor in her fingers slowly stopped. The grounding wire was connected. The panic drained out of her, replaced by a weary but solid resolve. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll pack the records." I let go of her hands, the loss of contact immediate, and stepped back to give her space to breathe. "I'll help you carry them to the interior closet." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in attrition. I barely slept. I drafted the ex parte motion in the dark, running my laptop off the battery bank in my car. At dawn, I drove to the county courthouse, waiting in the rain for the clerk's office to open. I filed the motion, slamming the 200-page forensic audit onto the counter. I didn't leave the building until the duty judge signed the stay, legally blocking Apex from stepping foot on the Gardner estate. When I drove back to the house, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained a heavy, oppressive gray. Madeline was waiting on the porch. When I stepped out of the car, I didn't smile. I just held up the signed court order. She let out a breath she looked like she had been holding for 2 days. She didn't run down the stairs. She just stood there, her hand resting on the wooden post, watching me walk up the gravel drive. "The locks stay," I said as I reached the bottom step. "The hearing is set for Friday morning at 10 a.m. It's a hard date, no more delays." "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped down to the first stair, putting us at eye level. "I don't know how to repay you for this, Luca." "You pay my firm's standard hourly rate when this is over," I replied smoothly, deflecting the emotional weight of her gratitude. "We haven't won the room yet. We just secured the battlefield." The final obstacle hit us on Thursday evening, less than 14 hours before the hearing. We were in the library, organizing the exhibits for the judge. I was cross-checking the page numbers on the printed briefs. Thomas had sent over the final affidavit from the state notary board. I opened the digital file on my screen and read the text. My jaw clenched. I read it again. "What is it?" Madeline asked, noticing the sudden shift in my posture. "The notary board," I said, my voice tight. "The notary whose stamp is on the fake deed. He died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack." Madeline stopped sorting the folders. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we can't compel him to testify tomorrow that he never stamped your signature," I explained, leaning back in the chair and rubbing my temples. "Apex knows this. That's why they pushed for the expedited hearing. They knew the primary witness was dead. They are going to argue that the digital metadata anomaly is a clerical error, and without the notary alive to deny it, it becomes a circumstantial argument." The room went silent. The safety net we had spent weeks building had just developed a massive tear. Madeline sat down slowly in the leather chair opposite the desk. "So, they win," she said, the fight finally bleeding out of her voice. "If it's circumstantial, the judge will side with the massive holding company. They always do." I looked at her. The defeat in her posture was unacceptable. I stood up, walked around the desk, and leaned against the edge of it, crossing my arms. "They don't win," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy air in the room. "Because the notary isn't the only proof. The lie is always in the math." I turned back to my laptop and pulled up the original loan origination documents. I need you to focus, Madeline. Where did the initial 2018 loan funds go? Bella's father borrowed $2 million against the estate. Where was it deposited? She looked confused, trying to switch gears. An offshore account, the Cayman Islands. Bella's father set it up. I never had access to it. Exactly, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. If you signed a quitclaim deed in 2019 to forgive that debt, there would have to be a consideration of value, a legal transfer. But Apex Capital didn't exist in 2019. I turned the laptop screen around to face her. Look at the corporate registry filing. Apex Capital LLC was incorporated in Delaware in January of 2020. They are a shell company that bought the distressed debt from the original lender. You cannot sign a quitclaim deed transferring property to a company that does not legally exist yet. Madeline stared at the screen, reading the dates. Her eyes widened. They messed up the timeline. They got greedy, I corrected. They tried to backdate the document to bypass the statute of limitations on the original debt covenant, but they forgot to check their own corporate inception date. I closed the laptop with a decisive snap. The dead notary doesn't matter. The math proves the fraud. We have them. Friday morning, the county courthouse. The air conditioning in courtroom 4B was set to a freezing temperature. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my tie perfectly aligned, my briefcase resting on the defendant's table. Madeline sat next to me. She wore a structured navy dress, her posture impeccable. She looked like a woman who owned the room, not a woman about to be evicted from it. The opposing counsel, a man named Sterling, representing Apex Capital, looked bored. He had the arrogant posture of a man who was used to steamrolling local property owners with sheer volume of paperwork. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, called the docket. Apex Capital versus Gardner, motion for summary judgment and execution of quitclaim deed. Sterling stood up. He didn't even unbutton his jacket. Your Honor, the matter is simple. The defendant surrendered her interest in the property via a signed quitclaim deed in March of 2019 in exchange for debt forbearance. We asked the court to validate the deed and allow my client to take possession of the asset. The judge looked over her glasses at me. Mr. Hansen, your response? I stood up. I didn't rush. I unclasped my briefcase, pulled out a single thin folder, and walked it over to the clerk, who handed it up to the bench. I didn't give a dramatic speech. I delivered measurable reality. Your Honor, I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet courtroom. The plaintiff is relying on a document allegedly executed in March of 2019. However, if you look at Exhibit A, you will find the certified incorporation documents from the Delaware Secretary of State. Apex Capital LLC was not formed until January 12, 2020. I turned slowly to look at Sterling. The boredom on his face had completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid panic. It is a legal impossibility for my client to have transferred property to a non-existent entity, I continued, turning back to the judge. Furthermore, Exhibit B contains the metadata analysis of the notary seal used on the document, proving it was digitally superimposed from a 2018 tax filing. The plaintiff has submitted a forged document to this court in an attempt to steal a multi-million-dollar generational property. The courtroom was dead silent. The only sound was the rustle of paper as the judge flipped through the exhibits. Sterling tried to stand, stammering. Your Honor, we were unaware. The document was provided by a third-party broker. Save it, counselor. The judge snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. She glared at the Apex lawyer. I am dismissing this motion for summary judgment with prejudice. Furthermore, I am invalidating the quitclaim deed entirely, and I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for a formal investigation into corporate fraud. She slammed her gavel down. We are adjourned. It was over. The guillotine had been dismantled. I will audit your parent company's entire 2021 portfolio and hand the discrepancies directly to the SEC. I stared at him, letting the silence hang. Do not contact my client again. Sterling opened his mouth, closed it, and turned away, walking quickly toward the parking lot. I turned back to Madeline. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 8 weeks was entirely gone. She looked at me, the sunlight catching the gold in her hair. She didn't look like a victim who had been saved. She looked like an equal partner who had just watched the enemy retreat. She reached out and took my hand right there on the courthouse steps, in full view of the clerks, the security guards, and the passing traffic. Her grip was firm. It wasn't a tentative, nervous gesture. It was a public claim. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of a signed contract. I looked down at our joined hands. The tremor of anxiety was gone. The absolute certainty of the moment settled over me. The chaos was over. The perimeter was secure. "We go home now," I said simply. We drove back to the estate in silence. It wasn't an awkward quiet. It was the comfortable stillness of a battle won. The house looked different as we pulled into the gravel drive. It no longer looked like a looming liability, a trap waiting to spring. It looked like a fortress. It looked like a sanctuary. We walked up the wooden steps onto the wraparound porch. The afternoon breeze was picking up, cooling the coastal air. I stopped near the wrought iron railing, the exact spot where the tension had fractured weeks ago. Madeline turned to face me. The distance between us, the professional boundary I had maintained with ruthless discipline, was gone. I looked at her. The exhaustion was still there, but her eyes were clear, bright, and focused entirely on me. I didn't need to ask permission with words. The consent was in the way she held her ground, the way she didn't look away. I stepped forward, closing the final gap. I didn't grab her. I reached out and rested my hands lightly on her waist. A functional, grounding touch. She let out a soft sigh and stepped into the space, resting her hands flat against my chest. When I kissed her, there was no frantic desperation, no hungry, chaotic exploration. It was the feeling of a heavy iron anchor dropping through deep water and locking perfectly into the bedrock. It was absolute stillness. The noise of the world, the audits, the ledgers, the past mistakes, the age difference, it all vanished. It was a seal on a promise, a profound sense of arrival. I rested my forehead against hers, closing my eyes, breathing in the quiet air of a life that finally made sense. The wandering was over. Looking back now, I realize that true partnership isn't found in grand, chaotic passion or the dramatic sparks that burn out quickly. I learned that healthy love is built on a foundation of absolute reliability and integrity. Real love isn't about holding someone tight so they can't fall. It's about building a solid foundation together so they never have to worry about the ground giving way. Winning the wrong way is actually losing. True victory is sleeping with a clear conscience, knowing you protected what matters most. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.